It begins with smoke, not the thick, oily kind that pours from burning rubber or a shattered engine, but the thin, almost ghost-white tendrils that creep along a fuselage when something inside an aircraft is going very, very wrong. The Halifax bomber, heavy, tired, and fighting a wounded sky, groaned as its frame shuddered. Men inside coughed through the haze. Instruments flickered like candles losing their last fight. And somewhere beneath them, far below the black void of occupied Europe, searchlights prowled like predators waiting for the moment the prey faltered. This is the story of the Royal Air Force Halifax crew who brought home a burning bomber in total darkness. A feat so improbable that even veteran pilots would later shake their heads in disbelief. A story of grit, instinct, and the tiny human decisions that determined who would live and who would never return from that night. But before we reach that final descent, before we sit in the cockpit beside a pilot half-blind from smoke, steering a dying aircraft through clouds he can't even see, we must travel back to the beginning, back to the airfields of Yorkshire, back to the young men who climbed into these machines knowing that 1 out of every 3 heavy bomber aircrew would never return. Because surviving a mission in Bomber Command in 1943 wasn't just bravery. It was luck, it was timing, it was fate, and sometimes it was a decision made in the dark. The Halifax, a giant of uncertain reputation. According to wartime records, the Handley Page Halifax entered service in 1940, a robust but sometimes temperamental 4-engine heavy bomber. Crews respected it for its stability yet cursed its early designs for drags that cost them precious altitude and speed. It was not as beloved as the Avro Lancaster. Few aircraft ever were. But it was reliable and, more importantly, it was available when the RAF needed it most. A Halifax bomber wasn't a plane, it was a cramped steel world. The nose where the bomb aimer lay on his stomach. The cockpit, elevated slightly, cramped with gauges and steel beams. The mid-upper turret, a glass bubble of isolation. The wireless operator's cabin, dim and cluttered. The tail gunner's turret, a cold, lonely coffin of plexiglass. Those who flew them rarely romanticized the job. They respected the Halifax because it survived hits, because it carried them home when everything else fell apart. And that is precisely what it would have to do on the night of February 15, 1943, during a deep penetration raid over Germany. The men who would face the fire, this particular crew belonged to number 158 Squadron, operating from RAF Lisset. Their names, recorded across various post-war interviews and squadron logs, belonged to the many thousands who formed the backbone of Bomber Command. Pilot Officer Henry Harry Langford, pilot. Flying Officer Tom Weaver, navigator. Sergeant Alfie Morgan, wireless operator. Sergeant Eric Stokes, flight engineer. Sergeant Colin James, bomb aimer. Sergeant David Davy Barnes, mid-upper gunner. Sergeant William Hawthorne, tail gunner. 7 men, 7 roles, 7 fates tied to the thin skin of an aging bomber. Like most Bomber Command crews, they were young, painfully young. Langford, the old man of the group, was just 24. His tail gunner had joined the RAF before he turned 20. Their faces, preserved in blurred photographs, carry the familiar wartime look. Boys asked to grow old too quickly. What held them together was not ideology or duty alone, but dependence. When you fly into the heart of Germany at night, your survival is stitched directly to the man beside you. If the navigator made one error, they could drift into deadly Flak corridors. If the flight engineer mismanaged fuel, the plane would never reach the coast. If the pilot panicked, they wouldn't make it off the target. If the gunners hesitated for 1 second too long, a German night fighter would tear into them. They were not individual soldiers. They were one machine, human and metal, fused by necessity. The briefing. This one will be hard. February 1943 marked one of the darkest periods of Bomber Command's war. Losses were severe. German night fighters had adapted. The Kamhuber line, a deadly grid of radar, searchlights, and fighter controllers, made deep raids a gamble. When the crew entered the briefing hall, the tension was immediate. A large map filled with red string lines showed the planned route. A long flight to bomb the industrial center of Lorient, a port city crucial to U-boat operations. Bomber Command had been trying to break the back of the German submarine fleet, and Loria's docks were vital targets. The intelligence officer didn't sugarcoat it. Expect heavy flak. Radar coverage is strong. Night fighter activity has increased along the inbound route. Stick to your timings. And gentlemen, watch the crosswinds. Every man in the room understood what that meant. Crosswinds meant drift. Drift meant wandering into sectors where German night fighters orbited like sharks. Yet no one asked to stand down. They had flown enough missions to know the score. Some nights luck followed you. Some nights it didn't. That night, they would learn what it meant to carry both fortune and misfortune at the same time. The takeoff into blackness. Night operations were a choreography of noise and flame. Ground crews swarmed the Halifax, loading bombs, checking engines, coaxing life from machinery that was older than many of the men flying it. Inside the cockpit, Harry Langford tightened his harness and took a deep breath. He often said later that takeoff was the worst moment, the moment he could feel the bomber's weight, the moment when any mechanical failure meant instant doom. The engines roared, throttle forward, metal rattling, the runway slipping beneath the wheels at terrifying speed. And then, a shudder, a groan, a moment that felt like the aircraft hesitated, as if reconsidering the night ahead. But the Halifax lifted, heavy and reluctant, into the sky. Beyond the airfield, the world dissolved into darkness. The approach, a perfect target for a night fighter. They flew for hours across the English Channel, across the French coast, and deeper into occupied territory. The blackness outside was absolute. Only the faintest glow from Langford's instruments lit the cockpit. According to the surviving mission logs, everything ran smoothly until they passed the halfway mark. That was when the wireless operator heard it, the distant, rising hum of an engine not their own. German night fighters, especially the feared Messerschmitt Bf 110, were equipped with Liechtenstein radar. They could see bombers in the dark even when bombers couldn't see them. In the mid-upper turret, Davy Barnes scanned the sky desperately. "Skipper, something's out there. 5 o'clock low." Before Langford could react, tracer fire sliced upward from the shadows. A sudden burst, a flash of sparks along the wing, a loud crack reverberating through the entire airframe. The night fighter had found them. Langford pulled the Halifax into a banking turn, but the bomber responded sluggishly, a sign that something had been damaged. The tail gunner opened fire, sweeping the sky in bright arcs, but the night fighter had already moved to a new angle. Then came the sound that every bomber crew dreaded, the dull thud of cannon shells hitting something critical. Smoke began to curl from the port wing. The flight engineer shouted numbers: fuel pressure dropping, temperature rising, electrical fluctuations across the left side of the aircraft. Something was burning, not roaring flames yet, but smoldering, growing, spreading, and they were still 40 minutes from the target. The decision, turn back or push on. Protocol said they should abort. A damaged bomber stood little chance of reaching the target and returning. But crews also knew the unspoken truth. If too many aircraft turned back, the entire raid could fail. And Bomber Command measured success in tons of explosives on target. Langford looked at his crew. Men coughing through smoke, men whose lives depended on him alone. "Navigator, can we still make it?" he asked. Weaver hesitated. "If the wind holds, yes. If it gets worse, we might not." The wireless operator said nothing. The gunners waited. The flight engineer checked the fire extinguishers, knowing full well they were not designed to control a sustained internal burn. Finally, Langford said the words that sealed their fate. "We finished the mission." For the next half hour, the Halifax flew wounded, limping toward Loriat. By the time they reached the target, the fire had grown stronger. But they completed the bomb run, dropping their payload in a clean, steady line that illuminated the sky below with orange flashes. That should have been the end of their duty. Instead, it was only the beginning. The real problem, they couldn't see. When Langford turned the Halifax toward home, the smoke inside the cockpit thickened. It stung the eyes, coated the throat. It blurred the instruments to a dim, unreadable glow. The engineer shouted through the intercom, Skipper, the fires inside the wing root, spreading fast. They could not extinguish it. They could not isolate it. And worst of all, they could not see. Flying through darkness was hard enough. Flying a 4-engine bomber with fire eating through its structure was madness. But Langford didn't flinch. He kept the aircraft level, even as flames licked along the underside of the wing. They were still over enemy territory. They could not bail out. Parachuting into occupied France meant near-certain capture. They had to get back to England, somehow. The calm before the descent. As they approached the French coast, the Halifax began losing altitude. Fuel lines were ruptured. Instrument panels flickered erratically. Oil pressure dropped in one engine, and the cockpit had become a haze so thick that Langford could no longer rely on gauges. He flew by instinct, feeling the aircraft's vibrations, listening to the engines, sensing the drift of the wind. Every man aboard understood the grim truth. They would have to land a burning aircraft at night without visibility, without reliable instruments, and with a crew half blinded by smoke. Meanwhile, the fire crept closer to the main spar, the single structural beam keeping the wing attached. One more hit, one more degree of heat, one more unlucky spark, and the Halifax would fall apart in midair. But the pilot held on. The crew held on. And ahead of them, somewhere beyond the black horizon, lay the coast of England, a faint promise of survival. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary landings ever recorded in Bomber Command's wartime history. The English coast was still nearly an hour away, but time had ceased to behave normally inside the Halifax. Minutes stretched, seconds dragged. Every small creak in the fuselage felt like a warning. Every flicker in the cockpit was a reminder that the aircraft was slowly, steadily losing the fight. Fire doesn't roar immediately inside a bomber. It starts as a whisper, a glow behind a panel, a smoldering ember, a warmth where warmth shouldn't be. But over time, as wood, insulation, wiring, and hydraulic fluids feed the flame, the whisper becomes a voice. And if left unchecked, that voice becomes a scream. By the time they reached the coastline of France, the fire inside Halifax HR 782 was speaking clearly. And it was saying, "Hurry." The cockpit turns into a furnace. Pilot Officer Harry Langford's eyes were burning. Not metaphorically, literally. The smoke had become so thick that the fine particles were embedding themselves under his eyelids. Every blink felt like dragging sandpaper across raw flesh. He had stopped wiping his face more than 10 minutes earlier. He needed both hands on the controls. Next to him, the flight engineer, Eric Stokes, kept the engines alive through sheer force of will. One throttle would surge, another would fail, and he compensated by adjusting mixture levels and fuel feeds faster than most men could think. He tried not to focus on the heat coming from the port wing route. He tried not to think about what would happen if the fire reached the main spar, because when a spar fails, a wing doesn't fold or droop. It snaps. Instantly. Catastrophically. He checked the gauges again. Left inboard engine. Overheating. Left outboard. Fluctuating pressures. Right side holding for now. "Skipper," Stokes shouted. "I can't guarantee how long the port engines will last." Langford didn't respond. He simply nodded. A gesture of acknowledgement, not reassurance. Meanwhile, in the rear, the gunners faced their own nightmare. In the tail turret, William Hawthorne sat in a bubble of glass colder than the rest of the aircraft. Smoke drifted back through the fuselage, but it thinned by the time it reached him. From his vantage point, he could see something the others could not. The fire was visible externally. Thin orange flickers danced along the underside of the wing, like malicious fingers probing for weakness. Each time they grew brighter, his stomach twisted. Tail gunners were expected to report engine fires. But Hawthorne hesitated. Langford already knew. Everyone already knew. And no pilot needed to hear a panicked voice confirming their worst fears. Instead, Hawthorne did what tail gunners often did when powerless. He watched their fate approach from behind. Davy Barnes, in the mid-upper turret, wasn't much better. He could see the glow through the fuselage, and the reflected light made it seem as though the aircraft were flying inside a lantern. He whispered to himself, a habit from childhood, reciting small fragments of a prayer his mother taught him. Not loudly, only enough for his own heartbeat to hear. Navigation by instinct alone. Flying Officer Tom Weaver, the navigator, sat hunched over his table, watching the compass needle drift and wobble. He couldn't rely on his maps anymore. Not fully. Smoke obscured his work. His eyes watered uncontrollably. He estimated wind drift on gut instinct and engine noise, not mathematics. And he made a brave decision. He switched to dead reckoning, a method where you assume your last known heading and speed and hope nothing changes too much. But everything was changing, constantly. When he looked up, Weaver saw something that chilled him far more than the fire. The stars had vanished. Cloud banks had rolled in below and above them, absorbing the horizon. They were now flying inside a featureless void. No stars above, no coastline glow ahead, no moon to give texture to the sky. They were alone in a black universe. He leaned toward the cockpit. "Harry, I need a few seconds of level flight to confirm our drift." Langford choked through the smoke. "Doing my best." The Halifax wobbled, fighting both flame and gravity, and Weaver used the brief stability to check their bearing with the remaining instruments still functioning. He made a call. "If we keep this heading, we'll hit England, but not where we planned." Langford didn't ask where. At that moment, any place on British soil was a victory. The aircraft begins to break apart. Somewhere deep in the wing, a structural bracket gave way with a metallic crack that shook the entire bomber. Stokes, the engineer, froze mid-movement. "Skipper!" That was the wing route. Langford didn't reply. He couldn't. His lungs burned too much to waste a breath. Instead, he squeezed the control column with white knuckles and kept the aircraft steady. They were now too low to bail out safely. Even if they weren't, parachuting into the channel at night was a death sentence. Their only hope was to reach a British airfield. Approaching England, but blind. Normally, returning bombers would call their airfields and request emergency landing lights or flares. But the Halifax's wireless had been damaged in the attack. Alfie Morgan, the wireless operator, pounded the set with his fist out of frustration, then tried again, tuning each frequency by tiny increments. Static, silence, then more static. The radio was useless. They were approaching England in total darkness, unable to communicate, with a burning aircraft that could explode at any moment. The irony was brutal. They were nearly home, and yet they couldn't tell anyone they were coming. The crew makes a choice no man ever wants to make. At this point, standard procedure would have been to order the crew to prepare to bail out at the last possible moment, giving the pilot a chance to crash land the bomber alone. But the situation made that impossible. The Halifax was too low, visibility too poor, the fire too unpredictable. If they attempted to evacuate, at least 3 men would likely die in the attempt. So Langford addressed them through the intercom, his voice rough, almost gone. "Stay at your stations. We're going down together." No one argued, not because they lacked fear, but because they trusted him. The search for any landing field, anything. England finally appeared below them as a faint, blurry patch of darker darkness. There were no identifiable towns, no coastlines visible, nothing to confirm precisely where they were. But then, through the haze, the faintest glow of runway lights flickered in the distance. Dim, scattered, but unmistakable. Stokes gasped. Weaver leaned forward. The gunners held their breath. A runway, or something that looked like one. It might have been a training field. It might have been an emergency landing strip. It might have been a decoy. The British used false airfields to mislead the Luftwaffe. But it didn't matter. It was long, it was flat, and it was their only chance. Langford angled the Halifax into a shallow descent. The final problem, they couldn't see the runway. The smoke in the cockpit had thickened into a rolling black fog that swallowed the entire instrument panel. Langford could barely see his own hands. He blinked furiously, eyes raw, vision blurred by tears. The cockpit glowed orange from the flames beneath the wing. Stokes leaned as close as he dared without obstructing the controls. "Harry, can you see the runway?" A long pause. Then, "No." Weaver, coughing behind them, made a desperate suggestion. "I'll guide you down by timing. Keep a steady descent rate. I'll call altitude." Stokes added, "I'll watch engine temps. If number 2 dies, we're done." Barnes, voice trembling, said, "I'll tell you if you're drifting left or right. I can just barely see ground lights through the turret." 7 men, 7 voices. 1 blind pilot holding a burning bomber steady in a night sky. This was not landing technique. This was survival. The descent begins. The Halifax rocked violently as Langford lowered the landing gear. One wheel locked into place. The other hesitated, then thumped into position. They were committed now. Weaver called out their approximate altitude. 200 feet, you're too shallow. Barnes shouted from the turret. Drifting left, skipper. Correct right. Stokes yelled. Number 2 engine at red line. In the tail, Hawthorne braced himself, knowing the impact would hit him first. The runway lights approached through the smoke like tiny ghosts. Faint, shimmering, barely visible. Langford whispered to himself, the only prayer he had left. Hold together. Just a little more. He pulled the control column back. The Halifax groaned. Sparks erupted under the port wing. The wheels slammed onto the earth with a bone-breaking force that nearly tore the fuselage apart. For a moment, everything was sound. Metal screaming, tires skidding, men shouting. And then, blackness. The aircraft skids to a stop. When the Halifax finally halted, one of the engines was still burning. Emergency crews sprinted across the field, silhouetted by the fire as they dragged hoses and extinguishers into position. Inside the fuselage, the crew sat motionless, stunned, breathless, alive. The cockpit canopy was pried open. Cool night air rushed in. Langford didn't move at first. His hands were still locked to the control column. Stokes gently unclenched them. Weaver stumbled out into the grass and vomited. Barnes collapsed to his knees, sobbing. Hawthorne climbed out of the tail turret, legs shaking so violently he could barely stand. They had landed a burning bomber in total darkness. Blind, breathing smoke, without instruments, with an aircraft on the edge of structural failure. Not one man died. The aftermath, a miracle the RAF never forgot. The RAF Board of Inquiry later wrote that the survival of Halifax HR 782 was extraordinary under the circumstances, and credited the crew's discipline and the pilot's exceptional airmanship. Langford received a commendation for bravery. Stokes, Weaver, and the others were praised for their composure and mutual coordination. But among themselves, the crew rarely spoke of it afterward, because they knew the truth. They survived because every man aboard refused to abandon the others. The Halifax burned for another 30 minutes after they evacuated. When the fire finally reached the internal spar, the wing collapsed into the grass with a hiss of steam and smoke. Had they stayed inside 2 minutes longer, the aircraft would have torn itself apart on the runway. Their survival was measured not in miles flown, but in seconds. Survival in war is never clean. It is never simply a celebration or a sigh of relief. For the Halifax crew, stepping out of the burning bomber didn't feel like victory. It felt like waking from a nightmare still echoing in their lungs. The night air was cold, sharp, almost painful after the smoke-filled furnace they had escaped. The runway lights glowed weakly through drifting embers. Fire crews moved with urgency around the broken aircraft, shouting orders, dragging hoses, dousing the last angry tongues of flame, still trying to finish what the German night fighter had started. The Halifax sat crippled and scorched, a hulking silhouette with one wing sagging unnaturally. One engine melted open like a wound, and paint blistered away to bare metal. It no longer looked like a weapon of war. It looked like a survivor, and in that moment so did they. But survival came with questions, and questions meant debriefing. What happened next was not dramatic. It was quiet, exhausting, human. The walk to the debriefing hut. A medical officer checked their eyes and lungs first. Burning aviation insulation produces toxic fumes. A crew could inhale enough to collapse without realizing it. Langford's eyes were nearly swollen shut from irritation. The doctor rinsed them again and again with saline until he could open them enough to see. Stokes coughed so hard blood streaked the handkerchief. Barnes's hands shook uncontrollably. Weaver's voice rasped from smoke inhalation. Hawthorne walked with a limp he couldn't explain. His leg had simply stopped working for a few minutes after they landed, but they were all alive. A flight lieutenant from the intelligence section escorted them to a small wooden hut near the dispersal area. Inside, a kettle hissed on a coal stove. A plate of biscuits sat untouched on a metal tray. Most aircrew remembered the debriefing rooms as strange places. Brightly lit, overly warm, almost peaceful, and yet filled with the heavy tension of what every man had just endured. The intelligence officer began gently. "Take a seat, lads. Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." The story told in halted voices. The debriefing lasted nearly 2 hours. Langford did most of the speaking, though his voice cracked repeatedly. He described the night fighters' approach, the initial burst of cannon fire, the fire in the wing route, the smoke in the cockpit. When he mentioned losing visibility entirely, the intelligence officer leaned forward. "You flew blind." Langford nodded. "For how long?" Langford's answer, quiet, almost ashamed, made the officer stare. 35 minutes, give or take." Weaver confirmed it. "Pilot couldn't see instruments. I had to estimate our altitude from drift and timing." Stokes added his part. "I kept the engines alive on instinct. Number 2 nearly cooked itself." Barnes recalled shouting corrections from the turret as the runway approached. Hawthorne noted the fire was visible externally for much of the final approach. The officer scribbled furiously in his notebook. He paused before the final sequence. "How did you maintain a controlled landing without visual contact?" Langford exhaled slowly. "We didn't land the aircraft," he said. "We landed each other." The officer stared at him for several seconds, then simply nodded. Some truths didn't require elaboration. The intelligence finding, a unique survival. A technical team inspected the Halifax remains the next morning. Their report, circulated internally, was blunt. Structural failure of port main spar imminent at time of landing. Another line followed. Survival of aircraft and crew unlikely under standard conditions. Translated from formal RAF language, it meant, they should be dead. They were not. We do not fully understand why. The airframe was deemed unsalvageable, but engineers dismantled key components for study, particularly the fire-damaged wing section. Understanding how long a Halifax could fly under such conditions was invaluable for future missions. The crew's survival became a quiet case study inside Bomber Command. Not for heroics, not for publicity, but for lessons. The informal hero's welcome. News travels fast on an RAF station. By breakfast, every crew knew that Langford's Halifax had landed burning and blind. When the men of 158th Squadron entered the mess hall, a hush fell over the room. Not dramatic, not rehearsed, just a sudden awareness, as if the entire hall were exhaling together. Several pilots stood up. A few engineers stepped aside respectfully. Someone muttered, "Bloody miracle, that one." Another said, "I wouldn't have flown 5 minutes in that." Langford felt uncomfortable with the attention. He sat quickly, eyes still red, shoulders slumped from exhaustion. He didn't touch his food. Stokes accepted a cup of tea from another engineer. Barnes sat staring at his hands, unable to steady them fully. Hawthorne tried to smile at a joke from a fellow gunner, but couldn't manage more than a half-hearted smirk. Survival doesn't feel triumphant. Not when you know others didn't come back that night. Because the empty chairs in the mess hall always say more than the full ones. The price of night missions. Not every crew returned. When the station commander posted casualty results on the board later that morning, several squadrons had missing crews. One Halifax failed to return. 2 Lancasters were lost over Germany. Another bomber had ditched in the North Sea. Langford's crew read the list in silence. They knew some of the names. They had chatted with them the day before. Shared cigarettes. Shared jokes. Shared the silent understanding that any conversation might be their last. For every miracle landing, there were dozens of planes that simply vanished. Swallowed by darkness, flak, mechanical failure, or night fighters. Bomber Command's losses were the stuff of grim statistics. In 1943, roughly 1 in 3 aircrew would not survive the war. Their miracle felt heavy now, almost unjust. A moment of reflection, and a question no one asked aloud. That afternoon, Langford walked alone to the wreckage of the Halifax. The fire crews had dragged what remained of the wing aside. Scorched metal bent in grotesque shapes. Charred wires hung like burned veins. A mechanic approached quietly. "Sir, if you hadn't come down right when you did, the whole wing would have sheared off. You were seconds away." Langford nodded, staring at the blackened skeleton of his aircraft. He didn't say the question that haunted him. Why did we survive when others didn't? No military manual had an answer. Nightfall. A new mission posted. By evening, the operations board was updated for the next night's sortie. Bomber Command never stopped, never paused, never waited for grief to settle. The war demanded momentum. When the squadron adjutant handed out the next day's flight plans, Langford skimmed the sheet, then paused. A new Halifax had been assigned to him. A fresh crew request form sat beneath it, authorizing any injured member to be temporarily replaced. He looked at Stokes, at Weaver, at Barnes, at Hawthorne. Not one of them said a word. Not one asked to stand down. Not one hesitated. Instead, the tail gunner, the quietest of them all, simply said, "We'll fly when you fly, Skipper." Langford didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded. There are bonds forged in war that defy explanation. Theirs had been welded in flame. And yet, the shadows remain. They slept poorly that night. Stokes dreamt of smoke choking the cockpit. Weaver dreamt of numbers drifting on a map he couldn't read. Barnes woke from nightmares of streaking tracer fire behind him. Hawthorne jolted awake, convinced the tail turret was filling with smoke again. Even Langford, the calm, steady pilot whose hands never shook in the cockpit, woke in a cold sweat, heart pounding, remembering the feel of the control column vibrating under his palms as the wing threatened to fail. Trauma doesn't announce itself. It lingers, and yet at dawn every man rose. Because RAF crews didn't fight for medals or glory. They fought because the man beside them got up too. The question history asks, and the one they never answered. When historians later studied the crew's survival, they focused on Langford's control under pressure, Weaver's navigation without instruments, Stokes's engine management under fire, the gunner's calm in the midst of chaos, the crew's cohesion during extreme crisis. But what historians rarely analyze is the human part, the quiet understanding shared in those minutes when death felt only inches away. The moment when men accept that survival may come down to instinct, or luck, or one last spark of courage. The Halifax bomber crew never spoke extensively about that night in public. Not because they were modest or haunted or unwilling, but because some experiences cannot be explained, only lived. And theirs had been lived in fire. What happened in the weeks that followed would soon test their limits again, in ways none of them expected. Because a miracle landing doesn't end a war. It only turns the page. There comes a point in every war story where the gunfire fades, the flames dim, and the frantic beating of survival finally slows. But for the Halifax bomber crew, the end of their tale wasn't the runway, or the debriefing, or even the medals quietly handed out in a modest ceremony weeks later. Their true ending lived in the years that followed, in memory, in silence, and in the quiet ways they carried that night with them for the rest of their lives. This is that final chapter. The last mission they never expected to fly. They flew again unbelievably only days after the crash. Bomber Command could not afford to rest its crews. Targets were waiting. New raids were planned. Cities and ports and factories needed to be struck. Every squadron was stretched thin, but something had changed. Langford no longer flinched at engine noises or wing vibrations. He studied them, learned them, felt them with a mechanic's intuition. Weaver refined his navigation to an almost uncanny precision, no longer trusting instruments alone. Stokes listened to his engines like a doctor checking a pulse. Barnes and Hawthorne sharpened their scanning arcs, learning to anticipate the faintest movement in the night sky. They were no longer a good crew. They had become exceptional. Their survival had not made them fearless. It had made them aware. And awareness in war was often the difference between living and disappearing into the night. The mission they would never forget. Weeks later, they flew an operation over the Ruhr, the industrial beating heart of Germany. It was a mission far more dangerous than the night their Halifax burned. And yet, they flew with a quiet confidence that only men who had already beaten impossible odds could understand. When Flak burst around them like thunder in the darkness, they tightened as one. When searchlights probed the sky, they held their breath in unison. When night fighters roared nearby, their gunners were calm, deliberate, unshaken. And when they returned to base, their landing smooth, their bomber intact. Stokes looked at Langford with a half-smile. After what we've been through, this feels like a holiday. They all laughed, the first true laughter since their miracle landing. The worst thing that could happen to them had already happened. And somehow, impossibly, they had survived. The end of their tour, and the beginning of a quiet life. Tour completion in Bomber Command came with mixed emotions. Some crews celebrated. Others felt guilty for surviving where so many had not. When Langford's crew finished their required number of missions, the station commander shook each man's hand. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic fanfare. Just gratitude, the kind of gratitude only wartime officers understood. Most crews dispersed soon after. Langford became an instructor, teaching new pilots how to land heavy bombers in difficult conditions. He never bragged about his own landing, he simply taught calmness under pressure. Weaver transferred to a navigation school and later lectured on dead reckoning techniques used when instruments failed. Stokes joined a maintenance analysis unit, helping design better engine safety protocols after studying their crash. Barnes and Hawthorne returned to operational training units, passing on survival instincts to fresh gunners only 18 years old. Their legacy spread not through medals or headlines, but through knowledge, through the quiet mentorship that saved lives long after the guns fell silent. After the war, men, not myths. Most war stories end on the battlefield. But real veterans continue their stories in kitchens, gardens, workshops, quiet living rooms, carrying memories they rarely share. Langford married young after the war. He worked a simple job, raised 2 children, and rarely spoke of flying except when old squadron mates visited. Weaver became a schoolteacher, where his calm under pressure earned him the affection of thousands of students. He never told them that once, in smoke and darkness, he guided a burning bomber home. Stokes worked in civil aviation. Barnes became a postal clerk. Hawthorne ran a small hardware shop. Ordinary lives, chosen lives, lives earned in one night of extraordinary courage. The reunion, and what it meant. Years after the war, at an RAF reunion, the surviving members of the crew found themselves sitting around a small wooden table, teacups warming their hands. They didn't talk about the night their Halifax burned. They didn't relive the terror, the smoke, the blinding descent. Instead, they spoke of life, children learning to ride bicycles, gardens refusing to grow tomatoes, jokes they once told in the mess hall, friends who hadn't made it home. Finally, near the end of the evening, Hawthorne, much older, voice softer, said, "I still don't know how we didn't die that night." Langford looked at him, took a slow breath, and answered, "Because none of us let go." Silence followed. Not sad, not heavy, just understanding. Because that was the truth. Their survival had never been about one man. It had been about 7, bound together in fear, trust, and determination. What history remembers, and what it forgets. Documents record facts, dates, aircraft types, damage assessments, commendations. But documents cannot record. The sting in Langford's eyes as smoke blinded him. The grip of Stokes's hand on the throttle as engines overheated. The tremor in Weaver's voice as he estimated altitude in darkness. The silent prayers of the gunners as fire crept along the wing. The invisible thread connecting 7 men determined to live. History remembers the outcome. Only they remembered the feeling. And because they survived, because they walked away from a landing that should have killed them, Their story became one more quiet miracle in a war full of tragedy. The final flight, a legacy written in sky and flame. The burned Halifax itself was scrapped. No museum displays its remains. No plaque marks the patch of grass where its wing finally collapsed. But its legacy lives in every RAF training manual that emphasizes crew resource management, in every lecture about teamwork under extreme conditions, in every simulator exercise where pilots practice flying blind. Those lessons were shaped by crews like Langford's, men who showed what human beings could do when every second mattered. Their story is not famous. It does not appear in sweeping documentaries or blockbuster films, but it is true, and it is real, and it is theirs. On a winter night in 1943, 7 ordinary men achieved something extraordinary. They brought home a burning bomber in total darkness, together, and in doing so, they left behind a legacy written not in medals or monuments, but in the simple, profound truth of their survival. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to keep flying anyway.